Okay, so thinking about a career in pottery and porcelain casting.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, taking clay and turning it into these really intricate and delicate pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And you've sent over some really great roll catcher guides
Mm-hmm.
for us to kind of take a deep dive with. They
Mm-hmm.
seem to cover like everything from the day-to-day of what these artists actually do to, like potential career paths, even like interview tips.
Right.
So are you ready to get our hands a little dirty?
Let's dive in. What's so fascinating to me is how this craft, it really resonates in today's world.
The guide even mentions that there's a growing demand for handcrafted, one-of-a-kind pieces. So, like, that suggests a real shift in what consumers, like, value these days.
Yeah.
Seems like more and more people are looking for authenticity and they're starting to, like, really appreciate the skill that goes into something that's handmade.
It's so true. And one thing I really like that the guide emphasizes is how this isn't about just mass production. It actually gets into all these different specializations within like the entire field.
Oh, wow.
We're talking fine arts, production, pottery, even like areas where you need a really good understanding of chemistry.
Wow. Okay.
So, depending on like what you're interested in, you could be designing these like really intricate molds or experimenting with like different glazes to get that perfect finish on a piece, or even like managing a whole team of people in a busy workshop.
And speaking of workshops, the guide actually does a really good job of, like, painting this picture of the day-to-day work environment. You
Yeah.
know,
Okay.
it can be physically demanding, like you really do need a certain level of stamina and precision.
Oh, wow.
And there's also an element of repetition, especially in roles that are, more production oriented. But like on the flip side, you're so directly engaged with the materials.
Yeah.
Like you're shaping them, you're molding them with your own hands.
Right.
And the guide really suggests that that sense of like tangible accomplishment of like you get to see your vision
Mm.
come to life in this physical form. It's incredibly rewarding.
Yeah. It's not something you find in every career, that kind of direct connection between like what you can do and then what the final product is.
Right.
And, it's interesting. The guide actually points out that pottery and porcelain casting, this is a field where technology hasn't like completely taken over.
Hmm.
Unlike some of the crafts that have become, pretty heavily automated, this one still really relies on those traditional skills, those techniques that have been passed down for like generations.
That's right. But that doesn't mean that there isn't any room for innovation.
Okay. Yeah.
In fact, the guide even highlights like a senior pottery and porcelain caster profile. And they were talking about how they're like constantly pushing boundaries. They're designing new products. They're developing these like cutting edge techniques.
Mm.
It's about like finding that balance, right? Between like honoring tradition, but then also making your own unique mark on the craft.
So we've touched on like, how much this work is in demand, how it blends like tradition and innovation, but let's get practical for a sec.
Okay.
The guide actually like maps out the different career stages that you might experience, which I thought was really helpful.
Yeah.
It seems like most aspiring artisans, they usually start as apprentices, so they master the basics under the guidance of like a really, really seasoned pro.
Right.
And then from there, the path can lead to more like, specialized roles, increased responsibility, potentially even running your own studio one day.
Mhm.
It's a journey, isn't it?
Absolutely. It reminds us that like building a successful career in this field, it takes time.
Yeah.
You have to be dedicated and you always have to be willing to learn, continue to evolve.
And speaking of preparation, this guide does not leave you hanging when it comes to like, the actual nitty-gritty of landing a job. It even provides like sample interview questions, which I thought was brilliant.
Oh, wow.
Imagine being asked about your experience with different types of clay or like how you ensure the quality of your finished products.
Right, right.
Talk about walking into that interview feeling confident.
Yeah, it's like having a secret weapon.
Totally.
Having those answers prepared, that can give you a real edge.
Totally. And the guide also mentions these professional organizations, the International Council of Museums and the American Craft Council.
Hmm.
They might sound kind of formal at first, but honestly, they're really incredible resources for anyone who's like serious about a career in this.
They offer opportunities for networking. You can learn from experts, and you can even, showcase your work to a wider audience.
Oh, wow.
It's about like, becoming part of a community, almost like a lineage
Yeah.
of artists who all share that passion for clay.
I love that perspective.
It's not just about working by yourself in your studio. It's about connecting with this community,
Yeah.
sharing your knowledge,
Mhm.
and then, contributing to the evolution of this really old craft.
Exactly. Now, let's take a closer look at what a typical day might actually look like for a pottery and porcelain caster.
Okay.
The guide goes into some detail about the process, and I have to say, it's even more intricate than I think I even imagined.
It really does highlight
Yeah.
the level of skill and precision that's involved.
Yeah.
The guide was describing how the artisans, they start with these molds, and they can be so detailed and complex. And they carefully pour the liquid clay. It's called slip casting.
Slip casting. Now that sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what all that involves? Because it's not as simple as just like pouring the clay in and hoping for the best, is it?
Oh, not at all. It is a delicate dance, my friend.
Mm.
It requires a deep understanding of the properties of the clay and the science of mold making. So let's break it down a little bit further after a quick break.
So before the break, we were really starting to get into the intricacies of slip casting. It sounds like a true art form, honestly, in itself.
It really is. Imagine this.
Hmm.
You're carefully pouring liquid clay, it's often called slip, into these meticulously crafted molds.
Okay.
And the real trick is to let it sit just long enough for a thin layer of that clay to solidify against the inside of the mold. So it forms the shape of the final piece.
Oh, wow.
And that requires a really keen eye because you have to know exactly how long to let that slip set based on its consistency, and the thickness that you want for the pottery.
It's amazing to me how much precision is involved in every single step.
Yep.
So what happens once that initial layer has set?
You pour out the excess slip so you're left with this really delicate shell of clay that's clinging to the mold. And then comes the really painstaking process of carefully removing the piece from the mold without damaging it.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that involves delicately separating the mold into different sections.
Oh, I can only imagine how nerve-wracking that must be, especially if you have these really intricate designs.
Oh, yeah.
You'd need the steady hands of a surgeon, I think.
Absolutely. And the guide even emphasizes that even after you get the piece out of the mold, you're not even close to being done.
Oh, really?
There's still so much fine-tuning to do,
Yeah.
smoothing out any imperfections that are on the surface, refining the edges, and then, maybe you're adding some decorative elements, all before it's ready for its big debut in the kiln.
It sounds like such incredible attention to detail, even for pieces that at first glance you would think would be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, you're right. And speaking of kilns, the guide actually goes into that stage of the process too. And apparently, depending on the size, and how complex the piece is, firing it can take days, even weeks.
Wow, see, I never knew it was such a lengthy process. I just thought you popped it in an oven and waited for the timer to go off.
Right. No. It's it's all about this delicate dance of temperature and timing.
Okay.
And the guide was explaining how if that kiln gets too hot or if the firing goes on for too long, you risk the piece cracking or warping.
Oh, no.
But then if it doesn't get hot enough, the clay might not harden properly.
So it's like a real balancing act. It's
Yeah.
like walking a tightrope between complete success and utter disaster.
Precisely. And as if that weren't enough, the guide also talks about how there are all these different firing methods that they use in pottery and porcelain casting.
Okay.
It seems like the method you choose really impacts the final look and the feel of the piece.
Hmm.
Some of them, they create this rustic, earthy finish.
Right.
And then others, it's this smooth, almost glass-like surface.
It really makes you appreciate all the artistry and the scientific knowledge that goes into making even something as seemingly simple as a ceramic mug.
It really does.
Yeah.
And, thinking about how complex the process is and how much dedication it takes, it kind of makes me wonder, what type of person, thrives in this kind of environment, surrounded by clay and kilns all day long.
That's a really good question. I'm actually really curious to hear what the guide has to say about the personality traits that lend themselves well to this particular path.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, not surprisingly, patience and meticulous attention to detail are at the very, very top of the list.
Okay.
But it goes even beyond that.
Okay.
The guide was saying that there's this need to be willing to experiment, to really embrace that inherent like unpredictability that comes with working with clay.
Right.
It's definitely not a job for somebody who needs everything to be like perfectly controlled and predictable.
That makes sense. I mean, you are working with these like natural materials and they have a mind of their own. You have to be pretty adaptable, comfortable with, a little bit of chaos.
Exactly. And let's not forget creativity, right?
Yeah.
Like even though you might be working with molds, there's still so much room for like your artistic expression.
Right,
Like
yeah.
the way that you finish the piece, the glazes that you decide to use, the elements that you incorporate to, make it decorative.
You're right. It's about like bringing your own unique style, your own vision to it, to the craft.
Precisely. And the guide actually gives this example of this senior pottery and porcelain caster, and they specialize in creating these custom pieces for clients.
Oh,
So imagine like working one-on-one with somebody to take their vision, maybe it's a simple sketch, and you're turning it into this like tangible, usable piece of art.
that sounds incredibly rewarding. Okay, so let's say someone's listening to this and they're feeling really inspired and they're like, I want to just like jump in headfirst to this world of pottery.
Mm-hmm.
What advice does this guide have about breaking into the field?
Well, it doesn't sound like you need a trust fund to get started, which is always a plus.
That is a good point. Yeah.
The guide, they emphasize how important it is to gain practical experience.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's something as simple as like volunteering at a local pottery studio or like, assisting a more experienced caster.
So it's about just like getting your hands dirty, literally, and,
Yeah.
and learning the ropes from people who've mastered the craft.
Exactly. And remember those professional organizations we were talking about?
Yeah.
They're not just for like the seasoned pros,
Yeah.
The guide actually encourages aspiring casters to get involved really early on, like go to workshops, get involved with the online forums, start to build a network of mentors and peers. These are all like really valuable steps.
It's really like any kind of creative pursuit, right? Like you're immersing yourself in the community, you're soaking up as much knowledge as you can, you're finding your people.
Yeah.
And speaking of like trends, I was kind of fascinated by the guide's insights into how the styles and pottery and porcelain casting, like how they're constantly evolving.
Yeah, it's true. On the one hand, the guide, they note that there's this like resurgence of interest in traditional techniques and these handcrafted pieces. This like, this desire for authenticity, for like a connection to the past.
Yeah.
It's definitely trending.
It speaks to that, that yearning for something unique, something that's like, made with care and intention.
Absolutely. But then at the same time, the guide also highlights how contemporary artists are like experimenting with all these like new materials and they're really like pushing the boundaries of what you could even do with clay.
Wow.
It's this really dynamic interplay between honoring those traditions but then like embracing innovation at the same time.
That's what's so cool about like the art world, right? That constant evolution, people pushing boundaries, that blend of like the old and the new.
Yeah.
But let's be real, like practicality matters too.
Mm-hmm.
While it's great to like, follow your passion, it's also important to kind of think about the job outlook for, a particular field.
That is a very, very crucial point. And luckily the guide actually like addresses it head on.
Okay.
It projects that there's going to be a pretty steady job growth for pottery and porcelain casters over like the next decade.
That's encouraging. What's driving that kind of positive outlook?
Well, remember, like that increasing demand for those handcrafted goods we were talking about before.
Yeah.
It seems like that's more than just a fad. It's like a real cultural shift that's happening.
Right.
People are starting to place more value on quality over quantity, on unique pieces that have character versus, something that's mass produced.
So it's not just like this pipe dream to think about like pursuing something like pottery as a career.
Right.
There's like a real market out there for this kind of work, which is great for anyone who's even considering it.
Exactly. It kind of makes you wonder, could this be a career path that's not just like creatively fulfilling, but also one that could like offer a sense of stability,
Yeah.
in a world that oftentimes feels like unpredictable and always changing.
It's a really thought-provoking question, but before we get too carried away with like, these big existential thoughts, let's come back down to earth for a second.
Yeah.
And talk about like the practicalities of landing a job.
Okay, okay.
So let's say you've polished your resume, you've really honed your skills, and you managed to snag an interview for a pottery and porcelain caster position.
Mm-hmm.
What can you really expect?
Well, you probably won't be quizzed on, like, your Shakespeare.
Okay, good.
Right.
Right.
The guide actually gave some pretty specific examples of interview questions you might get asked.
Okay.
So, for instance, they might ask about your experience with all the different types of clay, earthenware, stoneware, porcelain, and how those properties like affect the casting process.
That's a great way to see like how much you understand the material and how it behaves.
Right. They might also ask like about your quality control methods, you
Right.
know? Like how do you make sure that your work is consistent? How do you check for any imperfections? These are all questions that really show that you understand this craft deeply and that you're committed to making, really high quality pieces.
It's like they want to make sure you're not just like following a recipe, like you get it.
Right, exactly.
Uh,
And this is where those interview questions can get really interesting, I think.
okay.
The guide was mentioning how they might even like throw you a real curveball.
Oh, okay.
Like describe a time when like you faced a challenge during the casting process and how you like, problem solved your way out of it.
Oh, I see. Those are my favorite kinds of questions. It's a chance to really show them how you think on your feet, that you're not afraid to, get your hands a little dirty. And I mean that both literally and figuratively.
Absolutely. It's all about like, showing how adaptable you are, you're resourceful, that you really just have this passion for like finding solutions. And these are all such like, valuable qualities like in any creative field, don't you think?
Totally, yeah. And it goes back to, what we were talking about before with like how unpredictable it can be to work with clay.
Right. Exactly.
Because no matter how skilled you are, you're always going to encounter surprises.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to a really crucial point that the guide makes throughout all of the material.
Okay.
And that's the importance of always continuing to learn in this field.
Yeah, yeah.
Like it's not enough to just master those basic skills.
Right.
Even those like seasoned professionals, they're constantly working on their techniques. They're, experimenting with glazes. They're staying up on all the latest industry trends.
It's that growth mindset, right? That's what keeps it exciting. Knowing that there's always something new to learn, a new technique to like try out, just another level of artistry that you can achieve.
Totally. And the guide actually gives like a really fantastic starting point for, that journey, that ongoing journey of discovery.
Okay.
Like they list a bunch of resources,
Right.
books, workshops, online communities, so you can connect with other artists, learn from the masters, really expand your horizons.
It is really inspiring when you think about it that way, because even though you might be in your studio working alone, you're still part of this much bigger community, like a lineage of artists who have like, been shaping clay for centuries.
It's a pretty amazing legacy to be a part of.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our little deep dive here into this world of pottery and porcelain casting, what would you say like is the one key takeaway you're hoping our listener like really walks away with?
I think it's realizing that this career path, it really offers this unique blend of like creativity and then like the actual technical skill that's involved. And it's this connection to both like, tradition and innovation at the same time. It's so much more than just making things, It's about bringing beauty and functionality into the world. And you're doing it one like carefully crafted piece at a time.
That was beautifully said. And for somebody who has the passion, the dedication, a love for, just feeling that clay take shape in their hands, it could be the most fulfilling path for them.
Absolutely. So if you're out there listening and you feel that little pull towards this world of pottery and porcelain casting, don't ignore it. Dive in, explore, experiment, and see where it takes you, because who knows, you might just discover your passion.
Wouldn't that be something?